Kia ora koutou, no mai haere mai, and welcome to Mahi Matters, New Zealand's employment market update. First of all, forgive us if we're a little bit rusty today. We've had a couple of weeks off with the Easter and Anzac Day breaks, so just go easy on us. Today we're talking about the cost of living crunch and are New Zealand wages keeping up to date? Okay, so let's go through and talk about the living wage hike. Okay, so from the 1st of September, the New Zealand living wage will increase to $28.95 an hour, a move that comes amid ongoing concerns about the rising cost of living. As many continue to feel the financial pressure, this increase aims to ensure workers earn enough to meet basic needs. However, it can also raise important questions for employers and businesses about cost pressures and competitiveness. Will the upcoming living wage increase help combat New Zealand's continued rising cost of living? So to discuss this further, we're joined today by Gina Lockyer, Executive Director at the Living Wage Movement. Kia ora, Gina.
Kia ora, Shannon. Thanks for having me.
No problems. Thanks for coming on board. Now, for those of us who may not be familiar, can you tell us about the Living Wage Movement, what it is, how it got started?
Yeah, sure. So the Living Wage Movement first started in 2012, and it was in response to observations by people across community groups, people that were at the grassroots of their communities, noticing that life for people doing a hard day's work was just getting harder. So these are people that had observed this from basically from the 1990s onwards, just noticing that hardworking New Zealanders were struggling a lot more and that there were lots of different reasons for that. So things like changes in employment legislation to the economic circumstances, so just different ways that businesses were evolving. But all in all of those together were impacting our most vulnerable, lowest paid workers. And so groups from unions, community and faith groups got together to consider what would be one way to sort of alleviate this pressure on low wage workers. And they took this concept from the UK of the living wage and wanted to test out whether it would work here. So there were sort of three stages to our evolution. That was building a movement around people who were experiencing low wage work and the struggle around that by building people power. There was also actually having a credible way to calculate a living wage for New Zealand. And then the third was being able to develop a program where employers could jump on board to make a commitment around paying the living wage. Now, the thing is one of the key drivers around this was also that often the lowest paid workers in our businesses are those indirectly employed. So when I say indirectly employed, I mean often brought in by a contracting company. So workers like cleaners and security guards and caterers. Those are really the key place that we wanted to focus on as a movement. They often get forgotten about in those employment arrangements. And actually the living wage employer program, that's its one point of difference there, is that all the accredited living wage employers must also ensure that the living wage is paid to indirectly employed staff as well. So yeah, that's been going on for over 10 years now, and every year since 2013, we've had living wage updates, and we've seen real success stories and the difference that it's made to workers and employers alike. So I'm excited to share what's happening now too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And of course, we're due for an increase in the living wage rate. And it feels like, well, we definitely have been talking about cost of living for quite some time, and it's really taking a while to get a handle on that. Do you believe that increase is going to be sufficient for workers to be able to meet their basic needs?
Yeah, it's really interesting because since we started in 2012, lots has happened in the market and the economy. We've had pandemics, all sorts of things that happen in the course of a decade, and the living wage was never a silver bullet to address all of those issues around the cost of living. And it has to be a pragmatic figure as well. So just a little bit of background around how it gets calculated, and then differing views about whether it meets the needs or not. The living wage is independently calculated, so we commission that work to happen. Every 5 years, it's recalculated with around 20 data sets based on how many calories does it take to feed a person well. What does it cost to send a child to the pools? What's the average rental price across New Zealand for, say, a 3-bedroom home? These data sets are put together to come out with a market rate. And it actually also includes things like subsidies, from the government of the day. And all that work happens and it spits out an hourly rate. Every year in between those recalculations, the living wage changes depending on the hourly average earnings across New Zealand. So it's a pragmatic approach. And again, because it's a market rate, it applies blanket to whatever the job might be, whatever the age a person might be, wherever they live in New Zealand. We had to find something that would work. I think equally, the number is never going to be a luxurious lifestyle. It was always designed to be able to meet people's basic needs and that little bit more, because we believe basic needs are actually about being able to participate in society. It's about living with dignity. So we often hear people talk about, being able to, say, fix something that's broken a little bit more quickly, put some money away, having choice around what they can put in their children's lunch boxes. And on an even bigger scale, for some families, it means that at least one parent doesn't have to work both a day and a night shift. So across the decade, every year that the living wage has changed and always been that bit higher than the minimum wage, we hear stories about just the difference that little bit of extra makes. And that's stood the test of time over the past 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's about not just about, the bare minimum to survive, and you'd hope the minimum wage at least covers that, but it's that difference between actually living and being able to participate. Now, of course, it's evolved along the years, and a big push is to get businesses or employers accredited. So for those that are not currently accredited for as living wage employers, what are some of the challenges and also incentives they might face in adopting a living wage?
Yeah, so the living wage employer program or accreditation has a few criteria. The two main ones are obviously that you pay at least a living wage to your directly employed workers, but also a living wage to your indirectly employed workers. And usually those are people that do regular and ongoing work in your organisation or business. Most often cleaners, actually. That's probably the core part. Look, there are challenges to this. That's a big workforce often for big organisations and small alike. Two that we hear the most is obviously how are you going to pay for it? That juggle around budget lines and the finances and all those challenges that businesses have to face. And I think that's why our message really is, it is voluntary, but we really challenge, and our living wage employers do too. They challenge people in their industry to consider, if you can afford it, do it. The other challenge that's often faced is around wage relativities. And the advice around that is that businesses and organisations have to look at their remuneration as a whole and work out what are they going to do as that floor of the living wage continues to increase. How is that going to impact the rest of the business? We're not often privy to those discussions, obviously, but because we've had hundreds of employers meet this criteria across the past 10 years in a variety of different industries, we can be pretty confident that each business or organisation, because it's important to them, they're making those two things work, both meeting the expenses of that change and also how does it impact wages across their whole business. In terms of incentives, there's a few pieces we know from international and local research. We do know that paying a living wage results in higher retention, lower absenteeism. So those expenses overall are often, they're mitigated because of those things. Some more incentives include the fact that actually, if you look even bigger picture, often workers aren't as reliant on government subsidies when they're paid the living wage. So you're looking at the kind of economic impact, us as taxpayers, our money going to other things apart from trying to prop, lower wage workers up. There was an interesting study around actually worker well-being and happiness as a whole. Often at about the point of the living wage, worker satisfaction and well-being spikes, and anything lower than that, people are often impacted by obviously financial stress, which has a real burden on people. Their health outcomes are lower because of that stress, and you're not turning up as kind of your best self to work. And I've talked to cleaners and security guards who often, for example, can end up in a workplace that isn't paying the living wage versus one that is. And when they end up being able to stay in a workplace that pays the living wage, they want to stay, they work hard, and they feel appreciated. That's a really massive thing. And I was just reading some of our testimonials from employers recently, and one of them said, look, I never did this to get, gratitude or acknowledgement. I did it because it felt right. And then they're bumping into cleaners, and the cleaners are in tears and saying thank you because of the difference it's made. Another interesting piece of data that came out from some of the studies was that even for workers that are getting paid well above the living wage, the fact that they know that everyone in the workplace is being, I guess, cared for and acknowledged in this way also increases their well-being and their satisfaction around their workplace. Those are all the incentives. That's just what's happening internally. Being a living wage employer and an accredited one means that you're in the club. People are looking and noticing who is in and out of this club. We're seeing it on social media, people coming to us, asking us who's doing it, who isn't. And when people become accredited, they're making that public statement as well.
Absolutely, and those flow-on effects, as you say, and the impact that it has both on workers, the businesses, and larger society are just so important. You mentioned, people pay attention to who's in the club, who's out of the club. There was a fairly public removal from the club recently, so with the government, I guess, lifting their intention to no longer offer the living wage for employees. And it kind of goes to show that the businesses and organizations on board, as you say, usually it comes from a place of a feeling of doing the right thing, but also taking into account all those other benefits there. I'm sure there's lots of different examples of businesses that have really seen the success of integrating the living wage into their models. What are some of the standouts, or showcasing how it can work and the lessons that can be learned from that?
Yeah, we sort of put this accreditation program out there for people to, give a go. We started off with 20 in the first year, and at our peak, we've had nearly 400. And they're all sorts of industries. It's fascinating, like arborists, cafes, all of the banking sector, local councils. I think the diversity of that sort of suite of employers show that it's possible to do this in any sort of industry. Some real highlights for me in particular are around hospitality, because we know that there's a struggle in that space, but equally it's a struggle for both. So employers have to be on their game in order to stay competitive, but their workers are also most vulnerable to low wages. So some stories I've heard about actually just employers having that mindset of making it a priority. It's like they take the time to look so detailed into their budget that they're looking at, okay, how often is the waste management company coming to pick up our waste? Like, can we cut a day in order to pay the living wage? How much flour are we, sort of getting to create this amount of food? So this like really finite balancing of the budget in order to also make profit as well as pay their workers a living wage has like heartened me, because they've put it at the heart of their business. And then they tell me, yeah, so when we advertise for jobs, we are getting the cream of the crop, and we're getting lots of people coming our way because that's our point of difference. So that's exciting to see. I think another thing that is quite heartening is if you go into bigger organizations who have, there's lots of work that has to be done to make this happen for them sometimes, because they have to ask, their cleaning companies, their procurement line to pay a living wage. They have to find the money to make that happen. But you know what? They put in the time and they do it. They look at their whole structure and how this is going to impact that. The time and consideration put into that is really powerful, and you show that it's because it's meaningful to them. We have principal partners from the banking sector and private health who they're really strong advocates for it, and they said, look, we've made it work. We looked at what are we doing at our Christmas party, because they want to be able to run a company where every person, even if that person's working in the middle of the night and no one sees them, goes home and can have a good life. So they make those adjustments accordingly. Really heartening to see the energy put into it. And then when we get to see the results, like when people, cleaners and security guards, tell us the difference that it makes, it's a really fulfilling situation for everyone involved.
Yeah, perfect. And you have touched on this a little bit already, but what kind of message do you think it sends to either job seekers or employees when they see that an employer is accredited as a living wage employer?
Yeah. So again, I think when a business is accredited, it's a commitment to every worker that's going to be on that workplace regularly, so indirectly and directly employed. And the evidence shows people want to work in a workplace where they know everyone will be respected in that space, that everyone can go home and not be in poverty. So people feel really heartened by that. And that's the difference with accreditation, is again, it is that public commitment and that check that's happened. So there's that reassurance there. We are seeing many of our employers putting it in their recruitment advertising, which shows it must make a difference, because they wouldn't do it otherwise. So that's been really good too. So it's often a headline in their advertising, because they know that it's what New Zealanders want. We're seeing, because of the momentum of our work, the response when the government has decided to make changes to their living wage policies, that's what New Zealanders workers expect. Even if they're not going to be impacted directly, even if they're well above the living wage, that's what they want to see. And they see that as part of both a business's success, but also their standing in the organization, in the community.
Excellent. Okay, I've got a bonus question for you here. If you're a job seeker, you're looking at potential employers, how can you find out if they are accredited, if they haven't listed it nicely on the ad?
Yeah. So we have all of our accredited employers on our website, livingwage.org.nz, where you can search those employers to find out who is accredited and look more into what it takes to become one as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was really interesting to find out more about that, and definitely something that's very worthwhile. So make sure to check out livingwage.org.nz to find out more. Let's take a look now at our social media poll. Okay, for Mahi Media today, we're talking about job security fears rising and looking into what's causing nearly half of Kiwi workers to worry about their job. So in a recent Understanding Aotearoa New Zealand Cost of Living report, found that 40% of kaimahi or workers are worried about job security. And a big part of that concern stems from uncertainty. Many are unsure if we're truly past the worst of it, with ongoing fears that unemployment may continue to rise through 2025. So it's no surprise that plenty of people will be watching the labour market stats release on the 7th of May with keen interest. But I have to say, I'm feeling cautiously optimistic. So there are some good signs of recovery. The monthly number of filled jobs in Aotearoa has edged upward so far this year, with a 0.1% rise in January and a 0.2% rise in March. Now, I know those aren't exactly champagne-worthy figures, but when you consider that we had 7 straight months of decline in 2024, I'm going to take that one as a win and a step in the right direction. And at Frog, we've seen around a 15 to 20% increase in job volumes in the first quarter. And the general sentiment from businesses that we work with is definitely shifting. So yeah, definitely last year was tough. There's no denying that. But now there's a sense of a real forward momentum. We're seeing teams being rebuilt, investment into new business areas, and a real focus on career development for existing staff. So while concerns about job security are still very valid, there are early signs that better times might be just around the corner. So let's take a look at some of the latest job opportunities. And this week's jobs opportunities are presented by the 2025 Q1 HR Mashup. So make sure that you stay ahead of the latest insights and analysis into top workplace trends and human resources updates. Visit frogrecruitment.co.nz to find out more. And as always, here's just a sample of some of the roles that we've got on board. So there's been a lot of activity in both our Wellington and Auckland offices. And that is it for today's show. Thanks for joining us again and hope to see you back here next week. As always, please feel free to put in your comments or suggestions for what you'd like us to cover in upcoming shows. See you then.